Sometimes the hardest things to fix are the ones we break ourselves. Jeremiah Washington knew the truth better than most, sitting alone in the farmhouse where his daughter's laughter once filled every room. After a heavy storm opened up a massive sinkhole in his backyard, the 58-year-old mechanic discovered something buried deep in the Georgia clay, a wooden hatch that had been hidden for decades. Inside wasn't just an old Cold War bunker. It was filled with letters, recordings, and maps that revealed his father's secret involvement in a resistance movement fighting injustice in the 1950s South. His father had never told him any of this. As Jeremiah listened to voices from the past, one question haunted him. If his father had kept such monumental secrets, what else didn't he know about his own family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Washington farm as Jeremiah stood on his front porch, coffee mug warming his calloused hands. At 58, he had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent under Georgia's unforgiving sun, fixing things that others had given up on. His shoulders, once broad and proud, now carried a slight stoop, not from age, but from the weight of 3 years of silence. The farmhouse behind him creaked in the morning breeze, its white paint peeling like old skin. This place had been in his family for generations, passed down from his grandfather to his father, and eventually to him. Now it felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that echoed in empty rooms. Keena's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it 3 years ago, the day she'd stormed out after their worst fight. Her childhood drawings still hung on the walls. Her teenage diary still filled the desk drawer, and her favorite quilt still lay folded at the foot of the bed. Jeremiah had told himself he kept it that way in case she came back, but deep down he knew it was because changing anything would make her absence feel permanent. The fight had been about everything and nothing, the way these things usually go between fathers and daughters. She'd wanted to move to Atlanta to chase some dream of becoming a social worker. He'd wanted her to stay, to help him run the farm, to carry on the family tradition. Words had been said that couldn't be taken back. Pride had built walls that neither of them knew how to tear down. "You never listen," she'd shouted from the doorway, her suitcase in one hand and car keys in the other. "You think you know what's best for everyone, but you don't know anything about what I need. I know you're making a mistake," he'd replied, his voice steady despite the breaking in his chest. "This land, this family, it means something. You can't just throw it all away for some city fantasy." Her laugh had been bitter. "This family? Dad, it's just you and me, and you've spent my whole life teaching me how to fix everything except how to talk to each other." The screen door had slammed behind her, and that was the last time they'd spoken face to face. Oh, there had been a few stilted phone calls in the first year, awkward exchanges about holidays and birthdays that neither of them celebrated together anymore. But even those had dwindled to nothing. Now Jeremiah spent his days in the workshop his father had built behind the house, repairing tractors and lawnmowers for neighbors who still remembered when Washington's Fix-It shop had been the heart of the community. His hands knew the feel of every tool, the sound of every engine, the particular way each piece of machinery breathed when it was healthy and when it was dying. His father had taught him that everything could be fixed if you understood it well enough, if you were patient enough, if you cared enough to do the work right. "A man who can fix things," his father used to say, "is never without purpose." But there were some things, broken hearts, broken trust, broken families that didn't respond to wrenches and screwdrivers. The toolbox sat on the workbench where his father had left it 20 years ago, the day he'd suffered the heart attack that took him away as suddenly as a summer storm. Jeremiah had never moved it, though he'd organized and reorganized everything else in the shop a dozen times over. The old leather case was worn smooth in places where his father's hands had gripped it, and inside, Each tool had its proper place wrenches arranged by size, screwdrivers sorted by type, everything clean and ready for the next job. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed too heavy on his chest, Jeremiah would run his fingers over those tools and remember the feel of his father's hand guiding his own. "Gentle now," the old man would say when 7-year-old Jeremiah got frustrated with a stubborn bolt. Force ain't always the answer. Sometimes you gotta coax things along. Let them know you're trying to help. Not hurt. Double quotes. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm would stop by occasionally, always with some excuse about needing her hedge trimmer sharpened or her mailbox post straightened. But Jeremiah knew she came to check on him, the same way she'd checked on his father in those final years after his mother had passed. She was one of the few people left who remembered when this place had been full of life, when his grandparents had raised 6 children here, when his parents had hosted church picnics under the old oak tree, when Keena had run barefoot through the garden every summer morning. "You need to call that girl," Mrs. Henderson would say, settling into the wooden chair on the porch with the familiarity of someone who'd been doing it for decades. Pride's a cold comfort when winter comes. But how do you call someone when you don't know what to say? How do you bridge 3 years of silence with a simple hello? How do you admit that maybe you were wrong without sounding like you're just lonely? The storm had come through 3 nights ago with the kind of fury that reminded folks why their grandparents had built storm cellars. Jeremiah had huddled in his bedroom, listening to the wind tear at the house and the rain hammer against the windows like angry fists. When morning came, he'd expected the usual aftermath: fallen branches, scattered debris, maybe some shingles torn from the barn roof. What he hadn't expected was the sinkhole dot. It sat about 50 feet behind the house, right where his mother's vegetable garden used to flourish. The hole was roughly circular, maybe 10 feet across, and deep enough that his flashlight beam couldn't find the bottom. The edges were clean, as if the earth had simply opened its mouth and swallowed a perfect circle of Georgia clay. He'd called the county office about it, thinking maybe it was something to do with an old septic system or a forgotten well. But the clerk had just taken his information and said someone would be out when they got caught up from the storm. That could be weeks. So Jeremiah had done what he always did when faced with a problem. He'd gotten his tools and started investigating on his own. The first thing he'd noticed, rappelling down into the hole with a rope tied to his truck's trailer hitch, was that this wasn't a natural sinkhole. The walls were too straight, too purposeful. Someone had dug this, then covered it over so well that decades of Georgia weather hadn't revealed it. The second thing he'd noticed was the hatch. It was made of thick planks, weathered gray but still solid, with heavy iron hinges that spoke of serious craftsmanship. Someone had built this to last, had meant for it to stay hidden. The wood bore the kind of wear that comes from decades underground, but the construction was sound, the work of someone who knew what they were doing. Standing at the bottom of that hole, flashlight beam dancing across the mysterious hatch, Jeremiah had felt something stir in his chest that had been quiet for too long. Curiosity, purpose, the kind of anticipation that comes with discovering something important. His father's toolbox had been sitting right there beside the hatch, covered in decades of settled earth but unmistakable in its familiar leather case. How it had gotten there, why it was there, Jeremiah couldn't begin to guess. But seeing it had sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool underground air. The old man had been secretive about some things, Jeremiah remembered. There had been hushed phone conversations that ended when children entered the room, mysterious trips to town that never had clear explanations, and a network of friends whose names were mentioned in respectful tones but never discussed in detail. Jeremiah had assumed it was just the way older folks conducted their business, with a kind of quiet dignity that didn't need to explain itself to the younger generation. Now, staring at that hatch with his father's toolbox beside it like a guardian at the gate, Jeremiah wondered if there had been more to those secrets than simple privacy. The tools inside the case were exactly as he remembered, each one in its proper place, cleaned and oiled and ready for work. But at the bottom, wrapped in an old chamois cloth, he'd found something that made his hands tremble. A key, old brass, worn smooth, with the kind of weight that spoke of serious locks and serious purposes. It fit the hatch perfectly. The sound it made when he turned it, a deep, satisfying click that echoed in the earthen chamber, was like something waking up after a long sleep. The hinges protested but gave way, revealing stairs that descended into darkness, deeper than his flashlight could penetrate. Whatever lay down there had been waiting for him his whole life. Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted across the morning air, calling his name from her kitchen door. She always started her day early, just like his mother used to do. The familiarity of it made his chest tight with memories of mornings when this place had been alive with conversation and purpose. "Morning, Mrs. H," he called back, raising his coffee mug in greeting. "You find out anything more about that hole, Jeremiah?" He paused, considering how much to tell her. Mrs. Henderson had known his father probably better than most. If anyone might have answers about what lay beneath his backyard, it would be her. "Still looking into it," he said finally. "Might be more complicated than I first thought." She nodded, wiping her hands on her apron in that unconscious way she'd done for as long as he could remember. "Your daddy always said this land had stories to tell. Maybe it's finally ready to start talking." The words sent another chill down Jeremiah's spine. What did she know? What had his father told her that he'd never shared with his own son? As Mrs. Henderson disappeared back into her house, Jeremiah finished his coffee and made his decision. Today, he was going down those stairs. Today, he was going to find out what his father had been hiding beneath the Georgia clay for all these years. The workshop called to him first, the old habits and the comfort of routine. He had 2 lawnmowers waiting for new spark plugs and a cultivator that needed its tines straightened. Honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the realm of questions without answers. But even as he worked, his eyes kept drifting to his father's toolbox, now sitting on his own workbench like a bridge between past and present. Whatever lay beneath that hatch, whatever secrets his father had kept, Jeremiah knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm's moisture, and somewhere in Atlanta, Keena was probably getting ready for another day of helping other people solve their problems while her own father sat alone in a farmhouse that echoed with everything they'd never learned to say to each other. But maybe, Jeremiah thought as he cleaned the spark plugs with the careful precision his father had taught him, maybe it wasn't too late to fix the things that mattered most. After all, his father had always said that understanding was the first step to healing, and understanding, it seemed, was waiting for him in the darkness below. The afternoon heat had reached its peak when Jeremiah finally gathered the courage to descend those earthen stairs. He'd spent the morning trying to convince himself that whatever lay below could wait another day, but the pull of mystery had grown stronger with each passing hour. His father's toolbox felt heavier than usual as he lowered it down with a rope, followed by a battery-powered lantern that would give him better light than his flashlight. The stairs were solid, carved from the same red clay that made up most of North Georgia, with wooden reinforcements that had weathered decades underground, but still held firm. Each step took him further from the familiar world above and deeper into something his father had never intended for him to find. At the bottom, the lantern revealed a space that took his breath away. This wasn't some simple storm shelter or root cellar. The bunker stretched further than his light could reach, with walls lined in rough-hewn timber and a ceiling supported by massive beams that spoke of serious engineering. The air was dry and cool, carrying the faint scent of old wood and something else paper, lots of it, aged and carefully preserved. Metal shelving units lined the walls, filled with boxes that had been organized with the same methodical care his father had applied to everything in his life. Each box was labeled in his father's careful handwriting. Maps 1954 to 1956. Correspondence. Meeting notes. Evidence. The last word made Jeremiah's pulse quicken. Evidence of what? He approached the nearest shelf with the reverence of someone entering a sacred space. The first box he opened contained photographs, dozens of them, black and white images that transported him back to a Georgia he'd never known. Men in work clothes gathered around trucks, families standing in front of houses he didn't recognize, and faces that were both familiar and strange. But it was the photograph, at the bottom of the stack, that stopped his heart. His father stood in the center of a group of 5 men, all of them young and serious, wearing the kind of clothes that marked the image as being from the 1950s. But this wasn't the father Jeremiah remembered, the quiet, careful man who taught him to fix engines and mend fences. This version of his father had fire in his eyes, determination in his posture, and his arm draped around the shoulder of a man Jeremiah had never seen before. On the back, someone had written, "The Brotherhood, 1954. After the Johnson meeting, Ebley, TM, RWSB, JW." The initials meant nothing to him, but the date made his hands tremble. 1954, the year of Brown v. Board of Education. The year the world had begun to change, slowly and painfully, in ways that some people had fought against with everything they had. What kind of brotherhood had his father belonged to, and why had he never mentioned it? Jeremiah set the photograph aside and reached for another box. This one contained letters, hundreds of them, organized by date and correspondent. He pulled one at random and unfolded the yellowed paper with careful hands. "Dear Franklin," it read in handwriting he didn't recognize. "The situation in Milledgeville is worse than we thought. 3 families burned out last week, and the sheriff claims he can't find any witnesses. We need to move the Hendricks family soon, before they decide to make an example of them too. Can you get word to the others? We meet Thursday as usual." It was signed simply T. Jeremiah's mind raced. His father's name was Franklin Washington. But the Franklin he'd known had been a mechanic, a quiet man who'd kept to himself and avoided talking about politics or social issues. This letter painted a picture of someone actively involved in what? Helping families escape? Fighting against injustice? He opened more letters, each one revealing another piece of a puzzle he'd never known existed. His father had been part of a network, a group of men who'd worked in secret to help Black families threatened by violence in the years following the Supreme Court's desegregation ruling. They'd provided safe houses, transportation, even false papers when necessary. The Brotherhood, as they called themselves, had been an underground railroad for a new era. But why hadn't his father ever told him? Why had he let Jeremiah grow up thinking he was just a simple mechanic in a simple town, when the truth was that he'd been a hero, someone who'd risked everything to protect innocent families? The questions multiplied with each box he opened. Maps showed routes between towns, with safe houses marked in a code that was starting to make sense. Meeting notes detailed plans to move families, strategies for avoiding detection, and the constant fear that they were being watched. Financial records showed money flowing to families in need, transportation costs, and payments for temporary housing. His father had been funding much of this operation out of his own pocket. In a box labeled personal, Jeremiah found items that made the abstract suddenly, painfully real. A child's drawing, given to his father by a little girl whose family they'd helped relocate. A thank you note from a mother who'd found safety for her children. A wedding invitation from a couple who'd been able to marry in freedom because of the Brotherhood's intervention. And at the bottom, a newspaper clipping that made his blood run cold. The headline read, "Local man dies in suspicious car accident." Below, it was a photograph of a man Jeremiah recognized from the group photo, the man his father had his arm around. The article was brief and clearly edited to avoid mentioning any details that might be considered sensitive. But between the lines, the message was clear. People who helped others sometimes pay the ultimate price. The date on the clipping was March 15th, 1958. Jeremiah did quick math and realized this was just 2 years before he was born. Had his father continued this dangerous work even after losing his friend? Had he carried on despite the threat to his own life? A new box revealed the answer. Letters dated through the early 1960s showed the Brotherhood gradually dissolving as some members moved away. Others became too frightened to continue, and the changing times made their particular form of resistance less necessary. But his father had continued helping individual families well into the decade, until Jeremiah's birth had apparently convinced him that the risks were too great. The last letter in the collection, dated December 1959, was from someone signing himself only as R. Franklin. I understand your decision to step back. You've done more than anyone could ask, and you have a family to think about now. But I want you to know that what we accomplished together, the lives we saved, the families we kept whole, that matters. That's going to matter long after we're gone. Your son is going to grow up in a better world because of what you did, even if he never knows it. Jeremiah's hand shook as he set the letter down. A better world. Had his father's sacrifices really made a difference? Had the families they'd helped gone on to build the lives they dreamed of? Had the children grown up safe and free because of what these men had risked? And why had his father never told him any of this? Why had he let Jeremiah believe he was just a simple mechanic when the truth was so much more complex and noble? The answer came to him slowly, painfully, as he sat surrounded by the evidence of his father's secret heroism. His father had kept quiet to protect him, to protect the families who might still be at risk if the wrong people learned about the Brotherhood's activities, to protect the other members who trusted him with their lives and their secrets. Franklin, Washington had carried this burden alone for 40 years, taking the truth to his grave rather than risk anyone else's safety. But now, somehow, the truth had found its way back into the light. The storm that had opened the sinkhole felt less like an accident and more like destiny, as if the earth itself had decided it was time for these stories to be told. Jeremiah looked around the bunker with new eyes, seeing not just boxes and papers, but a testament to courage he'd never known existed in his own family. His quiet, humble father had been part of something larger than himself, something that had required the kind of bravery that most people only read about in history books. And suddenly, sitting in that underground chamber surrounded by the evidence of his father's secret life, Jeremiah understood something about courage that he'd never grasped before. It wasn't always dramatic in public. Sometimes it was quiet and hidden, working in the shadows to make sure other people could live in the light. His father had been a hero not because he'd sought glory or recognition, but because he'd seen suffering and decided he couldn't stand by and do nothing. The Brotherhood hadn't been about politics or ideology. It had been about human decency, about the simple recognition that everyone deserves safety and dignity and the chance to build a life for their children. As he climbed back up those earthen stairs, carrying the group photograph in his shirt pocket, Jeremiah felt something shifting inside his chest. The loneliness that had weighed him down for 3 years was still there, but it was joined now by something else: pride, purpose, and a growing understanding that maybe his father's lessons about fixing things had been about more than engines and tools. Maybe they'd been about healing the world, one family at a time. But if his father had kept secrets this profound, what else didn't Jeremiah know about his own life? What other truths lay buried beneath the surface of the simple story he'd always believed about who he was and where he came from? For the next 3 days, Jeremiah found himself drawn back to the bunker like a man possessed. Each descent into that hidden chamber revealed new layers to his father's secret life, and each discovery left him more amazed and more confused about the man who'd raised him. The maps were perhaps the most intriguing discovery. hand-drawn with meticulous detail. They showed not just the obvious routes between towns, but back roads, creek beds, and paths through the woods that only someone who'd spent years walking this land would know. Safe houses were marked with small symbols, a cross for churches willing to hide families, a star for private homes, a circle for barns and outbuildings where people could rest during dangerous journeys. What struck Jeremiah most was how many of these locations he recognized. The old Methodist church on Highway 78, where he'd attended vacation Bible school as a child. The Hendricks farm, where he'd helped with hay baling every summer. The abandoned mill by Sweetwater Creek, where he'd gone fishing with his father dozens of times. All of these places had been part of a network he'd never imagined, a secret infrastructure of compassion that had operated right under his nose for years. How many of those fishing trips had actually been reconnaissance missions? How many social calls to neighbors had really been coordination meetings? The thought made him dizzy. His entire childhood, viewed through this new lens, took on different meanings. His father's insistence on teaching him every back road in 3 counties. The way older black folks in town always seemed to know Franklin Washington by name, even when Jeremiah couldn't remember meeting them before. The mysterious boxes that would sometimes appear in their barn for a few days before disappearing again. He remembered asking once about those boxes, when he was maybe 10 years old. His father had smiled and said they belonged to folks passing through who needed a safe place to store their things. At the time, Jeremiah had accepted this explanation without question. Now he wondered how many families had found refuge in their barn. How many children had slept safe in their hayloft while their parents planned their next move toward freedom. The maps also revealed something that made his skin crawl. Marked locations where danger was known to exist. Houses with red X's drawn through them. Roads marked with warning symbols. Names written in margins with notes like, "Watch out," and "Not safe after dark." Some of those names he recognized from his childhood men who'd served on the city council, business owners who'd been pillars of the community. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How do you reconcile the friendly pharmacist who'd always given you free lollipops with the red X marked next to his store on a resistance map? On Thursday morning, Jeremiah decided he needed answers that only Mrs. Henderson could provide. She was hanging laundry on the line between their properties, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had earned the right to take its time. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore the kind of sensible dress that spoke of a generation that believed in doing things properly. "Morning, Mrs. H," he called, approaching the fence that had separated their properties for 40 years. "Well, good morning, Jeremiah. You're up and about early today." He studied her face, looking for signs that she knew more than she'd let on about his recent discoveries. Her expression remained pleasantly neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," he began carefully, "about this land having stories to tell." She paused in hanging a pillowcase, her hand stilling on the clothesline. "Did I say that? Well, I suppose all old places have their share of history. Mrs. Henderson, I need to ask you something, and I appreciate an honest answer." He pulled the group photograph from his pocket and held it up so she could see it clearly. "Do you know anything about this?" The change in her expression was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from her face, and her hand went to her throat in an unconscious gesture of protection. For a long moment, she stared at the photograph without speaking. "Where did you find that?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "In my backyard, along with a lot of other things I never knew existed." Mrs. Henderson looked around nervously, as if checking to see who might be listening. Then she walked over to the fence, her movements quick despite her age. "Jeremiah, you need to be very careful with that photograph. There are people, some of them still alive, who wouldn't want to see that image brought back into the light." "What people?" Mrs. Henderson, I need to understand what my father was involved in. She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of carefully kept secrets. Your father was a good man, Jeremiah, one of the best men I ever knew. But he lived in dangerous times, and he did dangerous work. The Brotherhood? Her eyes widened. You know about that? I know some of it. I know they helped families. I know it was risky. But I don't understand why he never told me. Mrs. Henderson glanced around again, then gestured for him to come closer to the fence. When she spoke, it was in the tone of someone sharing a confidence that had been kept too long. Your father never told you because telling you would have put you in danger. Even now, even after all these years, there are people who remember. People who lost power, lost influence, lost money because of what the Brotherhood accomplished. They're old now, most of them, but some grudges die hard. What kind of danger? The kind that ends with mysterious accidents and houses burning down in the middle of the night. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. 3 of the men in that photograph died within 5 years of it being taken. Car accidents, hunting accidents. A house fire that the fire department said was caused by faulty wiring, even though everyone knew that family had just had their electrical system updated. Jeremiah's blood ran cold. Are you saying they were murdered? I'm saying the people who fought against injustice in the 1950s sometimes paid a higher price than they expected. She reached out and touched his hand through the fence. Your father was smart enough to step back when you were born. He knew that some fights are worth dying for, but no fight is worth orphaning your child. The implications hit him like a physical blow. His father had given up this work he clearly believed in, work that was saving lives because he'd become a father. The sacrifice must have been enormous, double quotes, Mrs. Henderson. How long have you known about this? Since the beginning. My late husband was part of it too, in a smaller way. We provided food sometimes, temporary shelter when it was needed. Your father, he was one of the leaders, one of the ones who took the real risks. And you never said anything? What was I supposed to say? Oh, by the way, Jeremiah, your father was a civil rights hero who had a price on his head? Some secrets are kept to protect the people we love. Jeremiah looked down at the photograph in his hands, seeing his father's face with new understanding. The man he'd thought was simply quiet had actually been carrying the weight of dangerous knowledge. The man he'd sometimes thought was overly cautious had actually been one of the bravest people in their community. Double quotes, Mrs. Henderson. That first night I found the bunker, I saw a car parked down the road. It was there for about an hour, just sitting with its lights off. I thought it was kids, maybe, or someone having car trouble. But now you're wondering if someone knows you've been digging around in the past. He nodded. Jeremiah, listen to me carefully. The people who opposed what your father was doing, they're not all gone. Some of their children and grandchildren are still around, still in positions of power. If word gets out about what you found, if the wrong people start asking questions, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. What should I do? Be careful. Be very, very careful. And maybe it's time you called your daughter. The suggestion hit him like a physical blow. Why? Because some burdens are too heavy to carry alone. And because if something happens to you, she deserves to know who her grandfather really was. As Mrs. Henderson walked back to her laundry, leaving him standing at the fence with more questions than answers, Jeremiah realized that his quiet investigation of family history had suddenly become something much more dangerous. The past, it seemed, wasn't content to stay buried. And somewhere out there, people were watching that evening. Jeremiah descended into the bunker with a new sense of urgency. Mrs. Henderson's warnings had shaken him, but they'd also strengthened his resolve. If his father had risked everything to preserve these stories, then Jeremiah owed it to him to understand the full scope of what he'd accomplished and what it had cost him. In a box he hadn't yet examined, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, he found his father's journal. The leather cover was worn soft with handling, and the pages inside were filled with his father's careful handwriting. Unlike the official correspondence and meeting notes, this was personal, a record of thoughts, fears, and moral struggles that Franklin Washington had never shared with another soul. The first entry was dated January 3rd, 1954. Started this journal because T says we need to document what we're seeing, in case something happens to us and people need to understand why we did what we did. Don't know if I'm cut out for this kind of work. All my life I fix machines, things that break down in ways you can predict and understand. But the hatred we're seeing, the way people can look at children and see enemies instead of little ones who need protecting, that's a kind of broken I don't know how to repair. Jeremy's throat tightened as he read his father's words. The uncertainty, the moral weight, the recognition that he was stepping into something larger and more dangerous than anything he'd known before. It was all there in those carefully written lines. The entries that followed painted a picture of a man grappling with his conscience and his fears. February 15th, 1954. Helped the Morrison family get to Augusta tonight. 3 children, the youngest barely walking. The father kept thanking me, but I felt like I should be thanking him for trusting us with their lives. What if we make a mistake? What if someone follows them? What if? March 22nd, 1954. House on Mill Street burned last night. Family got out safe, but they lost everything. Sheriff says it was an electrical fire, but we all know better. This is what happens when you try to send your children to the white school. This is what happens when you believe the Supreme Court meant what it said. April 10th, 1954. T says we can't save everyone, that we have to focus on the families in the most immediate danger. But how do you choose? How do you look at one mother's tears and say hers matter more than another's? Some nights I lie awake thinking about the faces we've seen, wondering if the ones we couldn't help made it through on their own. As Jeremy read deeper into the journal, he began to understand the enormous psychological toll this work had taken on his father. Every successful evacuation was weighed against the families they couldn't reach. Every safe arrival was shadowed by the knowledge that others were still in danger. The responsibility of holding so many lives in their hands had aged his father in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time, but it was an entry from December 1959 that made Jeremy's eyes fill with tears. Eleanor told me yesterday that we're going to have a baby. Should be the happiest news of my life, and it is, but it's also the most frightening. How do I bring a child into this world, knowing what I know about the hatred that lives in human hearts? How do I teach him to be good when I've seen so much evil? And how do I continue this work when I have a son who needs his father to come home safe every night? The next entry, dated a week later, revealed the decision that had changed the course of his father's life. Told the others I'm stepping back after the new year. Can't risk leaving my child fatherless for a cause, no matter how just. T understands, he's got children too, but it feels like abandoning ship in the middle of a storm. The work isn't finished. May never be finished. But a man has to know when to fight and when to protect what he's already built. Jeremy set the journal down, his hands shaking. His birth had ended his father's involvement in the resistance movement. The knowledge was both humbling and heartbreaking. Humbling to realize that his father had chosen him over a cause that clearly meant everything to him. Heartbreaking to understand the sacrifice the choice had required. But there was more. The journal entries continued, chronicling his father's struggle to find meaning in a quieter life. The entries from Jeremy's early childhood revealed a man wrestling with whether he'd made the right choice. March 15th, 1962. Jeremy took his first steps today. Eleanor cried, and so did I, but for different reasons. She was crying from joy, I was crying because I realized I almost wasn't here to see it. If I'd kept up the work, if something had happened to me, I'd have missed this moment and 1,000 others like it. September 8th, 1965. Started teaching Jeremiah about tools today. His hands are so small, but he's eager to learn. Told him that fixing things is about patience and understanding, about taking the time to figure out what's really broken. Maybe if I can teach him that, teach him to see problems as puzzles instead of enemies, he'll grow up to be the kind of man who builds instead of destroys. November 12th, 1968. Jeremiah asked me today why some of the other children at school say mean things about people who look different from them. Didn't know how to answer without telling him things he's too young to understand. Settled for saying that some people are afraid of things they don't know, and fear makes them cruel. He nodded like he understood. But how can an 8-year-old really understand something that grown men kill each other over? Reading these entries was like watching his childhood from his father's perspective, seeing not just the external events, but the internal struggles, the constant effort to shield him from ugliness while preparing him for reality. His father had been trying to raise him to be better than the world around them, to see fixing things as both literal skill and moral imperative. The final entry in the journal was dated just 6 months before his father's death. December 20th, 1999. Jeremiah's engaged to that sweet girl. Eleanor he met in college, yes. Named her after his mother, which makes my heart full in ways I can't explain. Watching him work in the shop today, seeing the care he takes with each repair, the respect he shows for other people's belongings, I think maybe I did teach him something useful after all. He's gentle with broken things, patient with problems that don't have easy solutions. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's how we change the world, one careful repair at a time. Jeremiah closed the journal and sat in the quiet bunker, overwhelmed by the weight of understanding. His father's lessons about fixing things hadn't just been about mechanical skills. They'd been about character, about seeing problems as opportunities to help rather than frustrations to endure. The patience his father had insisted on, the careful attention to understanding what was really wrong before trying to fix it. These hadn't been just practical skills but moral ones. And now, sitting surrounded by evidence of his father's courage, Jeremiah realized he'd been approaching his relationship with Kina all wrong. Instead of trying to understand what had driven her away, he'd focused on being right, on defending his position, on proving that she was making a mistake. He'd treated their relationship like a machine, with an obvious problem instead of recognizing it as something delicate that required patience and genuine listening. His father's words echoed in his memory. Some people are afraid of things they don't know, and fear makes them cruel. How much of his fight with Kina had been driven by fear of being alone, fear of change, fear of admitting that maybe she was right to want something different from the life he'd planned for her? The parallels were uncomfortable but undeniable. His father had learned to step back from work he loved in order to preserve what mattered most. Maybe it was time for Jeremiah to consider whether holding on to his pride was worth losing his daughter forever. He climbed out of the bunker that night carrying his father's journal, feeling the weight of revelation and responsibility in equal measure. Back in the farmhouse, he sat at the kitchen table where he'd eaten countless meals with his parents, where he and Kina had done homework and shared stories about their days, where family had happened in all its messy, beautiful complexity. His phone sat on the counter, Kina's numbers still programmed in despite 3 years of silence. How many times had he picked it up, started to dial, then lost his nerve? How many conversations had he rehearsed in his mind, only to convince himself that she should call him first? Tonight felt different. Tonight he understood something about courage that he'd never grasped before, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you might have been wrong. He picked up the phone and dialed. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Her voice, unchanged and achingly familiar. "This is Kina. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." The beep seemed to echo forever. "Hi, baby girl." "It's Dad. His voice cracked, and he had to stop and breathe. "I found some things. Some things about your grandfather that I think you should know about. About our family. And I think maybe there are some things I should have said a long time ago. Some things I need to say now. Could you maybe come home? Just for a day. Just so we can talk. I know I don't have the right to ask, but please. I think Grandpa Franklin would have wanted us to figure this out." He hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by memories and hope and the terrible vulnerability that comes with reaching out across a chasm you helped create. Outside, the Georgia night settled around the farmhouse like a familiar blanket. But somewhere in the darkness, a car engine started and headlights swept across the road, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone keeping watch. Jeremiah turned off the lights and stood at the window, watching until the red taillights disappeared around the bend. Mrs. Henderson's warnings echoed in his mind, mixing uneasily with the hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to fix the one thing that mattered most. Friday morning brought no return call from Keena, but Jeremiah tried not to let disappointment cloud the small victory of having reached out. He'd taken the first step that had to count for something. Even if the response wasn't immediate, his attention turned to a discovery that had been nagging at him since the previous day. A large box in the bunker marked audio documentation. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, were dozens of reel-to-reel tapes labeled with dates, locations, and initials. The old Grundig tape recorder his father had kept in the living room suddenly made sense. It hadn't been for playing music, as Jeremiah had always assumed, but for something far more important. He spent the morning setting up the equipment in the bunker, rigging extension cords from the house to power the vintage machine. The first tape he selected was labeled Mrs. C.J. Testimony, March 1955. His hands trembled slightly as he threaded the tape and pressed play. The voice that emerged from the speakers was that of an elderly woman, speaking with the careful cadence of someone who'd lived through more pain than anyone should have to bear. "My name is Karina Johnson, and I'm 63 years old. Mr. Franklin asked me to tell my story. Said it was important that someone write it down, even if nobody ever hears it. I don't know about all that, but I know what happened to my family needs to be remembered." What followed was a testimony that made Jeremiah's chest tight with emotion. Mrs. Johnson spoke of her grandson's attempt to enroll in the previously all-white high school, of the threats that followed, of the night men in hoods came to her house with gasoline and matches. She described hiding in the root cellar while her home burned, clutching her grandson and praying they wouldn't be discovered. Mr. Franklin and his friends, they came for us that night, got us out through the woods to a safe place. My grandson, he wanted to fight them, wanted to stay and make them pay for what they'd done. But Mr. Franklin, he sat that boy down and explained something I'll never forget. He said, "Son, courage ain't about winning every fight. Sometimes courage is knowing when to step away so you can fight another day. Fight a fight you can win." The tape continued with Mrs. Johnson's account of the Brotherhood's help in relocating her family to relatives in Ohio, where her grandson eventually finished school and became a teacher. Her voice broke when she spoke of her gratitude. "People ask me sometimes if I'm bitter about what happened, if I hate the folks who drove us away from our home. Truth is, I don't have time for hate when I'm so full of gratitude. Gratitude for men like Mr. Franklin, who risked their own lives to save strangers. Gratitude for the chance my grandson got to become something more than hate would have let him be." Jeremiah sat in the quiet bunker long after the tape ended, processing what he'd heard. This wasn't abstract history. This was a real woman whose life had been saved by his father's courage. Her grandson was probably in his 70s now, maybe had grandchildren of his own who owed their existence to a group of men who decided that standing by wasn't an option. The next tape he played contained multiple voices, what sounded like a meeting of the Brotherhood, discussing logistics for moving 3 families in a single weekend. His father's voice was unmistakable, though younger and more confident than Jeremiah remembered. The key is timing and coordination. If we move them all at once, separately but simultaneously, it'll be harder for anyone to track the pattern. T. You take the Williams family north through the creek bed route. R. The Hendersons go west on the old logging road. I'll handle the Washingtons' different family. No relation, they go east toward Augusta. Another voice, older and gravelly, interrupted. Franklin, you sure about taking the eastern route? That's Johnson territory, and you know how they feel about our work. His father's response was calm but firm. It's also the safest route for a family with small children. The Washingtons have a 2-year-old who can't walk the distance the creek bed route requires. Sometimes you have to take the bigger risk to avoid the bigger tragedy. Listening to these planning sessions, Jeremiah gained new appreciation for the complexity of what the Brotherhood had accomplished. This wasn't reckless heroism but careful, strategic thinking. Every decision was weighed against multiple factors: the safety of the families, the security of the network, the likelihood of success. His father had been not just brave, but smart, a leader who'd inspired others to follow him into danger because they trusted his judgment. But it was the final tape in the box that broke his heart, labeled simply for J. Only if something happens. It contained his father's voice alone. Recorded sometime in the late 1950s, based on the age and tone. Son, if you're hearing this, it means I'm not around to tell you these things myself. And that's a shame, because there's so much I want you to know. First thing is that everything I did, every risk I took, every choice I made, it was all about trying to leave you a better world than the one I found. I hope I succeeded in that, but if I didn't, I hope you'll pick up where I left off. Jeremiah's eyes filled with tears as his father's voice continued. I know you might be angry about the secrets I kept. Might wonder why I never told you about this work, never gave you the chance to choose whether to be part of it. Truth is, I was selfish. I wanted you to have a childhood free from the weight of other people's hatred. I wanted you to grow up believing that most people are good, that problems have solutions, that trying to help others is always the right choice. Maybe that was naive, but I'd rather raise a naive optimist than a cynical realist. The recording crackled with age, but his father's words were clear. The tools I'm teaching you to use, they're not just for fixing engines and machines. They're for fixing whatever's broken in the world around you. Patience to understand the real problem. Skill to know which approach will work. Persistence to keep trying when the first attempt fails. And wisdom to know when you're in over your head and need to call for help. There was a long pause, and when his father's voice returned, it was softer, more emotional. If something happens to me because of this work, I don't want you to think it was a waste. Every family we helped, every child who got to grow up safe, that matters. That ripples out into the world in ways we'll never see, but that make everything we risked worthwhile. You're part of that ripple, son. Your children will be part of it. The kindness you show, the problems you solve, the people you help, that's all part of the same fight, just fought with different tools. The tape ended with words that would stay with Jeremiah forever. I love you, son. I'm proud of the man I know you'll become. And I hope that someday you'll understand that the most important thing a father can do is teach his children that they have the power to make things better. Jeremiah sat in the darkness of the bunker, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding the depth of his father's love and the weight of the legacy he'd been left. The tools, the patient teaching, the emphasis on understanding before acting, all of it had been preparation for a life of service he'd never recognized. And now, surrounded by evidence of his father's courage and sacrifice, Jeremiah realized that maybe it wasn't too late to live up to that legacy. Maybe the first step was healing the break in his own family, using the tools his father had given him to fix the most important relationship in his life. The question was whether Kina would give him the chance to try. Asterisk. Saturday afternoon found Jeremiah in the deepest corner of the bunker, examining a wooden chest that had been pushed against the far wall. Unlike the organized boxes and filing systems that made up most of the bunker's contents, this chest seemed more personal, more private. It was secured with a simple brass lock, but the key from his father's toolbox opened it easily. Inside, wrapped in velvet cloth, was a railroad watch, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship with intricate engravings and a chain worn, smoothed by decades of handling. But it was the inscription on the back that made Jeremiah's breath catch. To Moses Washington, for services to the underground. With gratitude and respect. 1858, Moses Washington. His great-grandfather, whose name he'd heard mentioned in family stories, but about whom he'd known almost nothing. The watch revealed that the family tradition of helping others hadn't started with his father. It went back generations, all the way to the original Underground Railroad. Below the watch, he found daguerreotypes and documents that painted a picture of a family legacy he'd never imagined. Moses Washington had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping enslaved families escape to freedom in the years before the Civil War. His son, Jeremiah's grandfather Thomas, had continued the work during Reconstruction, helping freed slaves find employment and establish new lives. And Franklin, Jeremiah's father, had carried on the tradition in his own era, adapting the methods to meet the needs of his time. The weight of this revelation was staggering. He wasn't just the son of a civil rights worker. He was part of a lineage that had been fighting for justice for over a century. The railroad watch wasn't just a beautiful antique. It was a symbol of generational courage, passed down from one man to another as they took up the mantle of protecting the vulnerable. A noise from above startled him, footsteps on the wooden floor of the house. Jeremiah quickly closed the chest and made his way up the earthen stairs, emerging to find Mrs. Henderson standing in his kitchen, looking worried. "I saw your front door was open and called out, but you didn't answer," she said. "Got concerned something might have happened to you. I was down in," he paused, still uncertain how much to reveal. "I was out back, working on something. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Henderson's expression was grave. "Jeremiah, I need to tell you something. Yesterday, after our conversation, I had a visitor. Man I didn't recognize. Said he was doing research on local families for some historical society. Asked a lot of questions about your father, about the old days. Wanted to know if I'd heard anything about you stirring up old business." The chill that ran down Jeremiah's spine had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I didn't know what he was talking about, that you minded your own business and kept to yourself." But Jeremiah, she moved closer, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the house. He knew things. Mentioned names I hadn't heard in 40 years. Asked about people who'd been dead for decades. This wasn't some casual historian. Did he leave a name? A card? Said his name was Patterson, but something about him felt wrong. Too polished for a researcher? Too interested in things that should be forgotten. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were filled with worry. "I think you need to be very careful, Jeremiah. Very careful indeed." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of a car engine approached the house. Through the kitchen window, they watched the black sedan pull into the driveway. Not the old car Jeremiah had been noticing, but something newer, more expensive. "That's him," Mrs. Henderson whispered. The man who emerged from the car was indeed polished, well-dressed in a way that suggested money and authority, with the kind of confident bearing that came from being accustomed to getting what he wanted. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the farmhouse and surrounding property. Jeremiah met him at the front door, Mrs. Henderson staying close behind. "Mr. Washington? I'm David Patterson." The man's smile was professionally friendly, but didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize for dropping by unannounced, but I'm conducting research on local families who were active in community affairs during the 1950s and 60s. I understand your father was quite well known in the area. My father was a mechanic, Jeremiah replied carefully. Fix things for folks. I'm not sure how much help I can be with historical research. Patterson's smile never wavered. Oh, I think you'd be surprised. Franklin Washington was involved in much more than auto repair. From what I understand, some of my sources suggest he had connections to various civil rights activities, networks that helped certain families relocate during turbulent times. The way he said, certain families made it clear this wasn't innocent academic interest. This was someone fishing for information, probing to see how much Jeremiah knew. I'm afraid I don't know anything about that, Jeremiah said. My father didn't discuss politics much. Of course. But perhaps you've come across some old papers recently? Family documents, correspondence, that sort of thing? I'd be very interested in purchasing any materials that might shed light on that era. The offer of payment confirmed Jeremiah's suspicions. This wasn't a historian. This was someone trying to buy silence, or at least trying to find out what needed to be kept quiet. I haven't found anything like that. He lied smoothly. If I do, I'll be sure to let you know. Patterson reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I certainly hope you will. And Mr. Washington, I hope you understand how sensitive some historical materials can be. Sometimes bringing old stories into the light can be painful for families who've moved on, built new lives. It would be unfortunate if anyone got hurt by well-meaning but misguided attempts to revisit the Tzvisti past. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Jeremiah accepted the card without looking at it. I understand perfectly. After Patterson drove away, Mrs. Henderson shook her head grimly. That man's no historian. He's someone with something to hide. Someone who's worried about what you might have found. Which means what I found is important enough to be dangerous. More dangerous than you know. Some of the families the Brotherhood helped, they went on to become prominent people. Successful people who might not want their backgrounds examined too closely. And some of the people they were running from, their children and grandchildren, are still around, still in positions of power. If this information came out, it could ruin reputations, destroy careers, maybe even result in criminal charges for things that happened decades ago. Jeremiah thought about the railroad watch, about the legacy of courage that had been passed down through his family for over a century. His great-grandfather had risked his life to help enslaved people escape. His grandfather had helped freed slaves build new lives. His father had protected families threatened by racial violence. And now someone was trying to intimidate him into burying that legacy, into pretending that none of it had ever happened. The irony wasn't lost on him. For 3 years, he'd been paralyzed by his inability to reach out to his own daughter, afraid of admitting he might have been wrong, afraid of risking rejection. But now, faced with actual danger, he felt something stirring in his chest that he recognized from his father's journal. Entries, the recognition that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. His phone buzzed, and he looked down to see a text message from a number he hadn't heard from in 3 years. Dad, got your message. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon. We need to talk. Keena was coming home. And whether David Patterson liked it or not, Jeremiah was going to make sure his daughter knew the truth about the family she came from, a family that had never backed down when people needed help, a family that had never let threats silence them when justice was at stake. The legacy of the railroad watch was about to continue. Sunday morning brought a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as Jeremiah prepared for Keena's visit. He'd spent hours deciding what to tell her first, how much to reveal, whether to show her the bunker immediately or ease her into the story gradually. But as he organized the documents he'd brought up from below, his attention was caught by a file he'd somehow missed one, tucked behind others in a box labeled Legal Documents. Inside the manila folder were papers that made no sense at first glance. Adoption documents, birth certificates, and legal correspondence that seemed to involve people whose names he didn't recognize. But as he studied them more carefully, a horrifying possibility began to take shape. The birth certificate at the top of the stack bore his name, Jeremiah Washington, the listed parents he'd never heard of. Robert Washington and Marie Jackson Washington. The date of birth was correct, but everything else was wrong. Below was a second birth certificate, this one showing Franklin and Eleanor Washington as his parents, with a date that was 6 months later than his actual birthday. His hands shaking, Jeremiah found the adoption papers. The legal language was formal and intimidating, but the essential facts were clear. Robert Washington, listed as his biological father, had been killed in what was described as an automobile accident under suspicious circumstances when Jeremiah was 3 months old. Marie Washington had died in childbirth. Franklin Washington, identified as Robert's closest friend and brother-in-arms, had legally adopted the infant and raised him as his own son. But it was the final document in the file that brought the full truth crashing down on him like a physical blow. It was a letter from Franklin to a lawyer, dated just weeks after the adoption was finalized. "I want it understood that this child is to be raised with no knowledge of his biological parents' work or the circumstances of their deaths. For his own safety and the safety of others who continue the work, Jeremiah must believe himself to be my natural son. If anything happens to me, these papers are to be destroyed unless there comes a time when he needs to know the truth for his own protection." Below that, in a different handwriting, someone had added a note. Franklin agreed, "But I'm keeping copies in the bunker safe. The boy has a right to know his father was a hero, even if he can never know it while the danger persists." The room spun around Jeremiah as the implications hit him. Everything he'd believed about his identity, about his family, about his place in the world, all of it had been a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect him. Franklin Washington, the man he'd called father his entire life, had been his adoptive father. The quiet mechanic who'd seemed so cautious, so reluctant to take risks, had actually been caring for the orphan son of a fallen resistance leader. His biological father, Robert Washington, had been one of the key figures in the Brotherhood's leadership. According to the documents, he'd been the one who'd organized the network's most dangerous operations, the one who'd taken the greatest risks. And he'd been murdered for it. A photograph tucked into the legal papers showed Robert Washington, a younger man with Jeremiah's eyes and jawline, standing next to Franklin with their arms around each other's shoulders. They looked like brothers, united by shared purpose and mutual respect. On the back, someone had written, "Robert and Franklin, after the Jenkins rescue, 1958, brothers in all but blood." Jeremiah sank into a kitchen chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of this revelation. The man he'd spent his entire life trying to live up to, Franklin Washington, with his quiet wisdom and patient teaching, hadn't even been his biological father. His real father had been a hero whose courage had gotten him killed, leaving behind an infant son who'd grown up never knowing the truth about his legacy. But the documents raised as many questions as they answered. Why had Robert Washington's murder been covered up as an accident? Who had ordered his death, and were those people still alive? How many others knew the truth about Jeremiah's parentage? The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted his reeling thoughts. Through the window, he saw Tina emerge from a silver Honda, moving with the same purposeful stride she'd inherited from both her parents. She looked older, more mature than when he'd last seen her, but unmistakably his daughter, his adopted daughter, he realized with a jolt, since none of the Washington bloodline was actually his own. The irony was bitter. For 3 years, he'd been clinging to the idea of family legacy, of carrying on the Washington tradition, of passing down the values and skills that had been passed down to him. Now he discovered that he'd been an outsider all along, taken in by a man generous enough to raise someone else's child as his own. Keena knocked on the front door. and Jeremy realized he was still holding the adoption papers. He quickly stuffed them back into the folder and went to let her in, his mind racing with questions about how much to tell her and in what order. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was cautious but not hostile or careful. Neutrality that suggested she was willing to listen but not ready to forgive. "Hi, baby girl. Thank you for coming." She looked around the kitchen, taking in the familiar surroundings with the expression of someone revisiting a place that held both comfort and pain. "You said you found something about Grandpa Franklin?" "I found a lot of things." He gestured toward the kitchen table, where he'd laid out some of the less explosive documents, photographs of the Brotherhood, some of the letters, evidence of the resistance work that was dramatic enough to explain his urgency without revealing the most devastating truth. "Kina, our family, your great-grandfather, your grandfather, they were involved in something incredible, something dangerous and heroic that I never knew about." For the next hour, he walked her through the story as he understood it, showing her the photographs, reading passages from the journal, explaining about the bunker and the network of families they'd helped. Kina listened with growing amazement, asking thoughtful questions and making connections he hadn't considered. This is why Grandpa Franklin was always so insistent about helping people, she said, studying a photograph of the Brotherhood. "Remember how he'd always stop for stranded motorists, always help neighbors with their problems, even when he had his own work to do? I thought it was just his personality, but it was actually his training. He was teaching us both," Jeremy realized. All those lessons about patience and understanding, about fixing things properly. He was passing down the values he'd learned from this work. "And this is why you called me." Kina's voice was soft, but there was an undercurrent of something he couldn't identify. "Because you realize that family legacy matters, that running away from difficult conversations doesn't solve anything." The question hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the parallel between his father's courage and his own cowardice, between Franklin's willingness to risk everything for others and his own inability to swallow his pride for his daughter. Among other things, yes. He took a deep breath. "Kina, I owe you an apology. A big one. I was wrong about a lot of things 3 years ago. Wrong about what you needed. Wrong about what I had the right to ask of you. Wrong about the way I handled everything." She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the photographs. "What changed your mind?" "Reading his journal. Seeing how much he sacrificed for other people's children, how he put their safety above his own desires. It made me realize that being a parent isn't about controlling your children's choices. It's about giving them the tools they need to make good choices on their own." "And you think I made good choices?" "I think you followed your heart and your principles, and that's exactly what I should have raised you to do. I was so focused on keeping you here that I forgot to ask whether here was where you needed to be." For the first time since she'd arrived, Kina smiled, not the polite, careful expression she'd worn at the door, but something genuine and warm that reminded him of the little girl who'd once helped him fix lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you too. Something I should have said 3 years ago." He waited, afraid to interrupt this fragile moment of reconnection. "I didn't leave just because I wanted to help people in Atlanta. I left because I felt like I was suffocating here, like you saw me as an extension of yourself rather than as my own person. But I also left because I was scared that if I stayed, I'd never find out who I was supposed to become." "And did you? Find out who you were supposed to become?" "I'm getting there." "But Dad," she reached across the table and touched his hand. "I missed you. I missed this place. I missed feeling like I belonged somewhere. The moment was perfect. Healing. Everything he'd hoped for when he'd made that phone call." But the adoption papers, hidden in the folder beside him, felt like a weight on his chest. Should he tell her now, while they were rebuilding their connection? Or would the revelation that none of them were actually related by blood destroy this fragile reconciliation? The decision was taken from him by the sound of another car in the driveway, this one moving fast. gravel spraying as it came to an abrupt stop. Through the window, they could see David Patterson getting out of his black sedan, no longer maintaining the pretense of polite inquiry. His expression was grim, determined, and slightly desperate. "Dad," Keena said quietly, "who is that man, and why does he look like he's here to cause trouble?" Patterson's knock was sharp and insistent, the kind of sound that demanded immediate attention. Jeremiah quickly gathered the photographs and documents spread across the table, shoving them into the folder with the adoption papers before moving to answer the door. Behind him, Keena stood with the alert posture of someone sensing danger. "Mr. Washington." Patterson's professional veneer had cracked, revealing something harder and more desperate underneath. "I think it's time we had a more direct conversation. I told you yesterday. I don't have anything that would help with your research. Please, Mr. Washington, we both know that's not true." Patterson's eyes moved past Jeremiah to take in Keena's presence. "And now you've involved your daughter. That's unfortunate. That complicates things considerably." The threat in his voice was no longer subtle. Jeremiah felt Keena move closer behind him, her hand touching his shoulder in a gesture that was both protective and seeking protection. "I think you should leave," Jeremiah said. "I think you should listen." Patterson stepped closer to the door, his voice dropping to a more intimate, menacing tone. "Do you have any idea what you're playing with? Do you understand the people whose lives you could destroy with whatever you found down there?" The reference to "down there" sent a chill through Jeremiah. How much did Patterson know? Had he been watching the house, seeing Jeremiah enter and exit the bunker? "Dad," Keena whispered, "what is he talking about?" Patterson smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You haven't told her, have you, about the bunker in your backyard? About the documents and recordings your father left behind? About the names and dates and evidence that could destroy half the prominent families in this county? Get off my property," Jeremiah said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm afraid I can't do that." "Not until we reach an understanding." Patterson pulled out his phone and showed them a photograph on the screen. A Kona, clear image of Jeremiah descending into the bunker, taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere across the field. "I've been documenting your activities, Mr. Washington. Insurance, you might call it." Keena grabbed Jeremiah's arm. "Dad, what bunker? What is he talking about?" Before Jeremiah could answer, Mrs. Henderson's voice called out from behind Patterson. "You need to step away from that door, son, before something happens that we'll all regret." They turned to see the elderly woman standing at the edge of the driveway, but she wasn't alone. 3 other people stood with her, 2 older black men and a woman with silver hair, all of them carrying themselves with the dignity of people who'd faced down worse threats than David Patterson. "Mrs. Henderson," Patterson said, his confidence faltering slightly, "this doesn't concern you. Everything that happens on this land concerns me," she replied firmly. "Especially when it involves the son of Franklin Washington and strangers making threats on his property." One of the men stepped forward, a tall, dignified figure with weathered hands and eyes that held decades of hard-won wisdom. "Mr. Patterson, is it? I'm Thomas Mitchell. I believe you've been asking questions about me." The recognition in Patterson's face was immediate and uncomfortable. Thomas Mitchell T. from the journal entries, one of Franklin's closest allies in the Brotherhood. He was still alive, still protective of the secrets they'd all kept for so long. "And I'm Robert Jackson," said the second man, shorter but no less imposing. "You've been asking about my family too, I hear." The woman with silver hair moved to stand directly in front of Patterson. "I'm Dorothy Williams. My maiden name was Johnson. Corina Johnson was my grandmother. She told me stories about a group of men who saved her life, and about people like you who tried to destroy theirs." Jeremiah's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. These people, the descendants and survivors of the Brotherhood's work, had been watching, waiting, protecting the secret just as his father had protected him. "Dad," Keena said urgently, "I need to understand what's going on here." Thomas Mitchell's eyes met Jeremiah's with understanding and compassion. "Son, your father was one of the best men I ever knew. He saved more lives than you can imagine, and he kept secrets that could have gotten him killed to protect the people he loved. But secrets have a way of surfacing when the time is right. This is exactly what we wanted to avoid," Patterson said, his voice rising with frustration. "Don't you understand? If this information becomes public, it won't just destroy the people who opposed the Brotherhood back then. It'll hurt the families you helped, the people who built new lives based on identities and stories that depended on the past staying buried." Dorothy. Williams stepped closer to him. "And don't you understand that some truths are more important than comfort? That some stories need to be told, regardless of who might be embarrassed by them?" "Easy words from someone who doesn't have skin in the game," Patterson shot back. "No skin in the game?" Her voice rose with indignation. "My grandmother lost her home, her community, everything she'd built, because people like your employers decided that children shouldn't go to school together. She spent the last 30 years of her life in Ohio, never able to come back to the place she loved, never able to visit the graves of her parents. Don't you dare tell me I don't have skin in this game." Jeremiah found his voice. "Mr. Patterson, I don't know who sent you or what they're paying you, but you need to understand something. This isn't just about old secrets anymore. This is about my family, about my daughter learning who her grandfather really was." "Your grandfather," Patterson said with a bitter laugh. "Do you want to tell her, or should I?" The moment hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Jeremiah looked at the faces surrounding him, Mrs. Henderson's worried expression, the protective determination of the Brotherhood survivors, Keena's growing confusion and concern. And in that instant, he realized that the time for partial truths and careful revelations had passed. "Keena," he said, turning to face his daughter fully, "there are some things about our family that I just learned myself. Things that are going to be hard to hear." "What things, Dad?" He pulled the folder from under his arm and extracted the adoption papers, his hands steadier than he'd expected them to be. "Franklin Washington wasn't my biological father. He adopted me when I was 3 months old, after my real father was killed." Keena's eyes widened, but she didn't speak. "My biological father was Robert Washington, no relation to Franklin, just happened to share the name. He was one of the leaders of the Brotherhood, and someone had him murdered to stop the work he was doing." Jeremiah's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Franklin raised me as his own son, never told me the truth, because he wanted to protect me from the people who'd killed Robert." "So you're not actually—" Keena began. "I'm not a Washington by blood, no. But Franklin loved me like his own son, taught me everything he knew. Gave me the kind of childhood that Robert Washington died trying to secure for other people's children." "Thomas," Mitchell nodded approvingly, "your biological father was my best friend's son. Franklin was a good man, but Robert was a great one. He had a fire in him, a refusal to accept injustice that got him into trouble, but also saved dozens of lives. And that's why," Patterson interjected desperately, "this all needs to stay buried. Robert Washington's murder wasn't just a random act of violence. It was ordered by people whose families are still prominent in this community. If that information comes out, then justice might finally be served," Dorothy Williams interrupted. "Even if it's 60 years late," Robert Jackson stepped forward. "Son, both your fathers were heroes, but they were also pragmatists. They knew that sometimes the greater good means accepting that perfect justice isn't possible. The question you have to ask yourself is, what would they want you to do with this information?" Keena had been quiet through this exchange, processing the revelations about her family history and the implications of the confrontation playing out around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Dad, whatever you decide to do with this information, I'm with you. But I think Grandpa Franklin and your biological father both believed that helping people was worth any risk. That's what all of this was about, wasn't it? Helping people, even when it was dangerous? Jeremiah looked at his daughter, his adopted daughter. He corrected himself, though the thought felt strange and wrong. The love he felt for her, the pride in her wisdom and courage, had nothing to do with shared blood and everything to do with shared values. "You're right," he said. "That's exactly what it was about." He turned to Patterson. "I'm not interested in destroying anyone's life or seeking revenge for things that happened before I was born. But I'm also not going to pretend that none of this happened. These stories matter. These people's sacrifices matter. And if that makes you or your employers uncomfortable, then maybe they need to be uncomfortable." Patterson's expression grew desperate. "You don't understand the forces you're dealing with. There are people who will do whatever it takes to keep this quiet. Then they'll have to deal with all of us," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Because Franklin Washington's son isn't alone in this. He's got family, blood family, and chosen family, and we protect our own." The standoff continued for another tense moment before Patterson, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, returned to his car. But his parting words carried a weight that no one could ignore. "This isn't over. Mr. Washington, some secrets are kept for good reasons, and some truths cause more harm than healing. I hope you're prepared for the consequences of whatever you do next." As the black sedan disappeared down the driveway, Jeremiah put his arm around Keena's shoulders, drawing strength from her presence and from the circle of allies who materialized to support him. The revelation of his true parentage had shaken his understanding of his identity, but it had also clarified his purpose. He was going to honor both his fathers, Franklin, who'd raised him with love and wisdom, and Robert, who died fighting for justice. And he was going to do it with his daughter by his side, building the kind of family that chose each other based on love and shared values rather than accidents of birth. But first, he had to show Keena the bunker and let her decide for herself what should be done with the truth they'd inherited. After Patterson's departure and the gradual dispersal of their unexpected allies, Jeremiah and Keena found themselves alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the weight of revelations and the uncertainty of what came next. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting familiar shadows in unfamiliar circumstances. "Show me," Keena said simply. Jeremiah led her to the backyard, to the sinkhole that had started this entire journey. As they descended into the bunker, he watched her face change from curiosity to amazement to something deeper, a recognition of standing in a sacred space. A place where history had been preserved by people who'd known its importance, even when they couldn't know its ultimate purpose. "My God, Dad," she whispered, running her fingers along the carefully organized boxes, the shelves of documents, the reel-to-reel tapes. "How long was Grandpa Franklin doing this?" "From 1954 to about 1960, when I was born. Then he stepped back from the active work but kept helping individual families for several more years." Jeremiah pulled out the box he'd been saving for last, the one marked "Personal for Family Only." Inside, beneath the railroad watch and the daguerreotypes of Moses Washington, were letters addressed to him in Franklin's careful handwriting. Letters that had been written over the course of decades but never delivered, each one sealed and dated, waiting for a time when the truth could finally be told. "He wrote to me," Jeremiah said, his voice catching. "For 40 years, he wrote letters he never sent, trying to find a way to tell me the truth." Keena picked up the first envelope, dated December 1959, just after his birth. "May I?" He nodded, and she carefully opened the H paper and began to read aloud. "My dearest son, for that's what you are, regardless of biology. Today you took your first breath, and I made you a promise that I intend to keep for the rest of my life. You will grow up safe. You will grow up loved. You will grow up free from the burden of hatred that took your biological father from this world." She paused, looking up at Jeremiah with tears in her eyes. "Dad, he loved you so much. Keep reading. I know that someday you may discover the truth about your parentage. And when that day comes, I want you to understand that Robert Washington was the finest man I ever knew. He died protecting families, protecting children, protecting the idea that all people deserve dignity and safety. If you grow up to be half the man he was, I will consider my job as your father complete." The next letter, dated on Jeremiah's 5th birthday, revealed more of Franklin's internal struggle with the secrets he was keeping. "Today you helped me fix Mrs. Patterson's lawnmower, and your patience with the stubborn carburetor reminded me so much of your biological father. He had the same gentle persistence, the same refusal to give up on things that seemed broken beyond repair. I'm teaching you these skills not just because they're practical, but because they're metaphors for how we should approach life with patience, understanding, and the belief that most things can be healed if we care enough to do the work." Letter after letter revealed the depth of Franklin's love and the weight of his responsibility. He documented Jeremiah's childhood milestones, his proudest moments, his concerns about how to raise a child while carrying such profound secrets. Each letter was both a confession and a love song, written to the son he'd chosen to raise and the man he'd hoped that son would become. The final letter, dated just months before Franklin's death, brought both of them to tears. "My son, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally found its way into the light, as truth has a way of doing. I hope you can forgive an old man for the deception, but I have never regretted the choice to raise you as my own. You have been the greatest joy of my life, and watching you become a man of integrity and compassion has been my proudest achievement. More than that, I hope you understand that the work we did, the families we helped, the lives we saved, it was never about politics or ideology. It was about love. Love for our neighbors. Love for children who deserve better than the world they were born into. Love for the idea that human dignity is not negotiable. You carry that love forward now, in the way you treat people, in the patience you show with broken things, in the kindness you extend to those who need help. Your daughter will carry it forward too, in whatever work she chooses, in whatever family she builds. The ripples of compassion spread farther than we can ever know." Tina wiped her eyes and looked at her father, her adoptive father. Though the distinction felt meaningless in the face of such profound love. "Dad, you realize what this means, don't you?" "What?" "We're not related by blood, but we're related by something stronger. We're related by choice, by the decision that love matters more than genetics. That family is about who chooses to stay, who chooses to help, who chooses to care." Jeremiah felt something inside his chest that had been tight for 3 years finally begin to loosen. "I'm sorry, Kina. I'm so sorry for not understanding that sooner, for trying to hold on to you instead of trusting that you'd choose to come back because you wanted to, not because you had to. And I'm sorry for leaving without trying harder to make you understand what I needed." She reached out and took his hand. "But Dad, we're here now. We're both here, and we know the truth about where we come from and what we're capable of." She gestured around the bunker, at the evidence of decades of quiet heroism. "What do we do with all of this?" Asterisk. The question hung in the air between them as they sat surrounded by the evidence of their family's hidden history. Kina pulled out her smartphone, a piece of technology that would have seemed impossible to the men who'd created this bunker, and began taking photographs of the documents, the reel-to-reel tapes, the carefully preserved artifacts that told the story of the Brotherhood. "We document everything," she said with the decisive clarity that Jeremiah remembered from her childhood. "Not to expose people or seek revenge, but to preserve the truth. These stories need to be told properly, by people who understand their importance. Patterson said that would cause more harm than good. Patterson was scared. People who do the right thing for the right reasons don't usually send threatening strangers to intimidate families." Kina held up her phone, showing him a photo she'd taken of one of Robert Washington's letters. "Dad, this isn't just our family history. This is American history. This is the story of ordinary people who chose to be extraordinary when their community needed them, as they worked together to document the bunker's contents. Jeremiah felt a shift in their relationship that went deeper than reconciliation. They were partners now, united not just by affection, but by shared purpose. The 3-year silence between them had been broken not just by apologies, but by the discovery of something larger than their individual disappointments. "I want to contact the university," Kina said as she photographed another box of correspondence. "Not to turn this into some sensationalized expose, but to work with historians who can help us tell these stories responsibly. People who understand that the goal isn't to hurt anyone, but to honor the courage of people like your fathers." The word fathers plural felt strange but right. Franklin, who'd raised him with patient love, and Robert, whose courage had made that loving possible. Two men whose legacies had converged in the child they both wanted to protect. "There's something else," Jeremiah said, remembering the mysterious visitor from earlier. "I think we need to find out who Patterson really represents. Mrs. Henderson and the others, they know more about this than they've told us. If we're going to move forward with preserving this history, we need to understand what we're up against." As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps on the earthen stairs announced a visitor. Thomas Mitchell's voice called down, "Jeremiah? Kina? Are you down there?" They emerged from the bunker to find not just Thomas, but all 4 of the people who'd stood with them against Patterson. In the evening light, they looked less like random neighbors and more like what they actually were, the surviving members and descendants of a resistance network that had operated in secret for decades. "We need to talk," Dorothy Williams said, "about what comes next, about what your decision to preserve this history means for all of us." They gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, around the same table where Jeremiah had eaten countless meals and where he'd first tried to process the magnitude of his discoveries. Mrs. Henderson put on coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done this in times of crisis before, and gradually, the full story emerged. "Patterson isn't working for the government or some historical society," Robert Jackson explained. "He's working for a group of families whose wealth and influence trace back to the period when the Brotherhood was active. People whose grandfathers owned businesses that depended on cheap labor, whose fathers held political positions that were threatened by integration, whose own careers have been built on foundations that don't bear a close examination." Thomas Mitchell leaned forward. "Son, when we disbanded the Brotherhood in the early 1960s, we thought we were ending something. We didn't realize we were beginning something else, a multi-generational effort to keep certain truths buried. Some of the people we fought against had children who grew up to be judges, politicians, business leaders. They've spent decades making sure that their family histories stayed clean. And now," Dorothy added, "you found evidence that could unravel some very carefully constructed narratives. Not just about what happened in the 1950s, but about how those events have shaped power structures that exist today." Jeremiah looked around the table at these faces lined with age but bright with the intelligence and determination that had made them effective resistance workers decades earlier. "What are you saying? That we should keep quiet?" "We're saying you need to be smart about how you proceed," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "These people have resources, connections, influence that we never had to deal with back in the day. If you're going to tell this story, you need to do it in a way that protects not just you and Kina, but all the families who were helped by the Brotherhood. Some of them are still alive, still vulnerable." Kina had been quiet through this exchange, but now she spoke with the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose. "And we don't do this alone. We build a coalition of historians, civil rights organizations, journalists who specialize in investigative work. We make this bigger than Patterson and his employers can suppress. And we make it about more than just the past," Jeremiah added, understanding beginning to dawn. "We make it about what we can learn from these people's courage, about how ordinary citizens can make extraordinary differences in their communities. Thomas Mitchell smiled, the first genuine smile Jeremiah had seen from him. Your biological father would be proud of that approach, son. Robert always said the goal wasn't to defeat the people who opposed us, but to build something so much better that opposition became irrelevant. Outside, the Georgia evening was settling into night, and somewhere in the darkness, David Patterson was probably making phone calls, reporting on the day's events, planning whatever came next in his effort to keep the past buried. But inside the farmhouse, surrounded by the people who'd carried these secrets for decades, Jeremiah and Kina were planning something else entirely. How to turn hidden history into a beacon of hope. How to transform family secrets into community healing. And how to honor the courage of previous generations by finding their own courage to continue the work. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the grounds of the University of Georgia as Jeremiah and Kina walked across campus toward the library where the Franklin and Robert Washington Civil Rights Archive was being officially dedicated. The collection, housed in climate-controlled cases and made available to researchers worldwide, told the story of the Brotherhood through documents, photographs, and recorded testimonies that brought the 1950s resistance movement into sharp, respectful focus. The dedication ceremony had drawn a crowd that would have amazed the original Brotherhood members, historians, civil rights leaders, students, and descendants of the families who'd been helped by the network. Mrs. Henderson, now 86 and moving slowly but determinedly, had flown in from Atlanta, where she'd moved to be closer to her grandchildren. Thomas Mitchell, Dorothy Williams, and Robert Jackson sat in the front row, their faces bright with the satisfaction of seeing their friend's work finally receive the recognition it deserved. But it was the faces in the middle rows that moved Jeremiah most. Deeply men and women in their 60s and 70s who'd approached him over the past months to share their own family stories. Children who'd been evacuated to safety by the Brotherhood. Parents who'd found new lives with the network's help. Grandchildren who were learning for the first time about the courage that had shaped their family histories. The Peterson family sends their regrets that they couldn't be here, Kina said, checking her phone for messages from the families they'd contacted during their research. But Mrs. Peterson wanted you to know that her father's stories about the angels who came in the night finally make sense now. The archive had become more than just a preservation effort. It had become a catalyst for healing and understanding. Working with university historians and civil rights scholars, they'd created an oral history project that encouraged families to come forward with their own stories, adding depth and nuance to the historical record while maintaining sensitivity about privacy and safety. David Patterson had made one final attempt to stop the archive, threatening legal action and suggesting that some of the materials had been obtained illegally. But his efforts had faltered when several prominent families, including some whose ancestors had been helped by the Brotherhood, publicly supported the project. The threat of exposure had lost its power once the story became public on terms that emphasized heroism rather than revenge. "Are you ready for this?" Kina asked as they approached the podium where Jeremiah was scheduled to speak. "I think so. Franklin and Robert, both my fathers, they would want this story told right. With dignity, with respect for everyone involved, with focus on what we can learn from their courage." The speech he prepared was simple and heartfelt, focusing not on the politics of the 1950s, but on the timeless principles that had motivated the Brotherhood's work. He spoke about the difference between inherited identity and chosen identity, about how families are created by love and commitment rather than biology, about the way courage passes from one generation to another, through example rather than genetics. My fathers, Franklin Washington, who raised me, and Robert Washington, who gave me life, they understood. Something that I'm still learning, he told the gathered crowd. They understood that fixing what's broken in the world starts with seeing other people's problems as your own problems, other people's children as your own children. other people's dreams as your own responsibility. In the audience, he could see faces that reflected the impact of that understanding, descendants of families who'd been helped, survivors who'd found new lives, young people who were learning about a chapter of history that had been hidden for too long. After the ceremony, Jeremiah and Kina walked back to the farmhouse together, driving through countryside that looked the same as always, but felt different, now like land that had finally been allowed to tell its stories. The bunker had been converted into a small museum space, open by appointment to researchers and families who wanted to understand their connection to this history. "Mrs. Rodriguez called while you were speaking," Kina said as they pulled into the driveway. "She found her grandmother's name in one of the documents we uploaded to the digital archive. Wants to know if she can come visit next month. Bring her children to see where their great-grandmother found safety." The farmhouse felt different too, not empty the way it had for 3 years, but full of purpose and connection. Kina had moved back, not permanently but regularly, splitting her time between her social work in Atlanta and helping to manage the archive and a steady stream of visitors who wanted to learn about the Brotherhood's work. They'd created something neither of them had expected, a new kind of family legacy, one built on shared values and chosen commitment rather than blood relations or geographical proximity. The revelation of Jeremiah's adoption had initially felt like a loss of identity, but it had ultimately freed them both to define family in terms that felt more authentic and meaningful. "Dad," Kina said as they sat on the front porch in the evening light, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if that storm hadn't opened up the sinkhole? If you'd never found the bunker?" Jeremiah considered the question, thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, isolated, stubborn, clinging to a version of family that had been built on assumptions rather than understanding. "I think we would have found our way back to each other eventually. But it might have taken a lot longer, and we might not have understood why it mattered so much. And now? Now I understand that the most important inheritance isn't property or genetics. It's the example of how to treat other people, how to stand up for what's right, how to choose love over fear." He gestured toward the bunker, now marked with a simple plaque that read, "In memory of those who chose courage when courage was dangerous. Franklin and Robert. They gave me different gifts, but they both taught me the same lesson, that being part of a family means being part of something larger than yourself, something that commits you to making the world better for the people you love." As the Georgia stars emerged overhead, grandfather and granddaughter sat in comfortable silence, surrounded by the peace that comes from understanding your place in a story larger than your own life. The work of preserving and sharing the Brotherhood's legacy would continue, but tonight, it was enough to simply sit together in the place where courage had been nurtured across generations, where secrets had been kept and finally revealed, where a family had been broken and rebuilt on foundations strong enough to last. In the distance, the sound of cars on the highway reminded them that the world continued to change, continued to need the kind of quiet heroism that had once operated in secret but now served as an inspiration for anyone willing to choose compassion over indifference, courage over comfort, and love over fear. The Washington family legacy, chosen rather than inherited, built on values rather than blood, was secure in hands that understood both its importance and its responsibility.